Thank you and welcome to Brave New Studios, everyone. It's my great pleasure today to have this conversation with not only my good friend, but wonderful inspiration for much of what we do at Brave New Films. Tom's ideas, his commitment to truth, his integrity, and most important, the number of books he's written and read. You see just a few of them here. And for those of you who are fortunate enough to stop by his office on the way out, it's my idea of heaven. It's completely filled, every square inch, with a book. And unlike many of us, he's actually read every one of these books. So the first question is, Tom's written a new book called The Long 60s that he's been talking about for a while. I highly recommend it. It's really interesting, and it's one of those books that makes you start to think more than before you read it and challenges your ideas. So a question, I've actually wanted to ask you this about some of the other books. Is there like one moment when you get the idea? Is it an aha moment, or is it a buildup of ideas? What leads you to the moment of, yes, this is a book and this is my idea and here's why I'm going to write it?
Well, Robert, you are a very good student of Freud, and I'll tell you the answer and you can make of it what you will. When I was very little, I discovered that I needed to express myself, and I found a way. I was good at reading and good at writing. I became the sports editor of my high school newspaper and the editor of an underground newspaper called the Daily Smirker when I was about 16. And so I would classify myself as a writer, as a person who needs to say something. I don't know if it's a gift or a compulsion, but all of my books and all of my writings seem to be this continuation of a compulsion. Now, as you know, it's Afghanistan and Pakistan. Earlier today it was Honduras. The internet has liberated my tendencies. I'm not saying I'm out of control, but an editor might make that comment.
And this book itself, was this long in the works? I mean, I remember thinking we talked about this almost a year ago.
I've been thinking about this book for a long time, and I once tried to write a book on the 60s and my experience, and I found that I couldn't get to it because I felt blocked. It was too recent, too soon. Then I wrote something that was about the 60s, sort of autobiographical, in 1988. But I keep returning to it, to the subject. And this one, I think, I'll be done with it. This one is a new theory of the 60s, and then a looking back from now, from the Obama era to the 60s, combined with charts to explain everything. And I don't think people realize this, but the driving force in getting the book done was the fact that starting in January will be the 50th anniversary of everything that happened in the 60s. So for the next 10 years, there will be anniversaries or denunciations or whatever about whatever happened in February, March, April, and so on. So I wanted to be ahead of the curve and give people a dateline. You know, you have women's calendars and African American calendars and all sorts of calendars. But so this has got a 60s calendar in it with a website to go with it.
And you mentioned the new theory of the 60s. Is that a fair way to characterize it?
Well, the usual theories about the 60s are non-theories. They either extol it as a golden time that's forgotten, or and will never be recovered, or they denounce it as bedlam and sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and a negative experience never to be returned to. Our president, characteristically of him, puts himself right in the middle of these views. He says that he's a pure child of the 60s, and on the other hand, he wants to distance himself from the tired arguments of the 1960s.
From the Tom Hayden Democrats, as he called them.
The Tom Hayden Democrats, he once said. The theory is that I was writing a book on how social change happens in American history, and when I got to the 60s, I turned it into a book in itself. But the theory in a nutshell is that social movements arise unexpectedly at the margins. No one ever predicts them. They break out through the direct action of handfuls of people, sometimes a poetic outcry, sometimes a protest or a sit-in. If they resonate with something that other people already feel from their past legacy, they'll march towards the mainstream. As they approach the mainstream, which means 40%, 30%, they'll start getting approached by politicians who will try to use them or abuse them. Eventually, in 100 days or 100 years, they will get to consensus on their original reform. They will succeed. The radicals will be alienated because it didn't go far enough. The reactionaries will be hysterically mobilized because they fear the coming of something that will take away their power. And then the rest is, it gets incorporated into everyday life. What's a good example? We more or less have vacations, but vacations were a revolutionary idea by Karl Marx and a few of his friends over 150 years ago. Now everybody takes credit. Nobody wants to shorten their vacation. So they get embedded in everyday life and you forget their origins. And my conclusion is that all or most of the good things we like about our country came from these radicals who didn't want reform. They wanted more, but they got reform. That's what they got. And we better live with that, not in patience or anything, but that's a fact. And the rest is the argument over memory. Do we remember it? Do we denounce it? Do we glorify it? Do we take lessons from it? And I found these to be cycles that I think explain everything about social change. They won't help your psychological dilemmas. They won't help you make a better film. But if you're a student of social change, this may be helpful.
So explain that a little bit. What are there particular general lessons we should be taking? Or are there specific lessons from the 60s, from accomplishments of the 60s, that we should be reflecting on, integrating in some way, moving from today?
Well, I made a list in the book, and I can't recite it from memory, but we can see it on the screen. People are usually surprised by it. It's about 25 or 30 huge changes. You're talking here about some things that people know all about. Voting rights for African Americans in the South, which was a prelude to the later coming of Barack Obama, who was, I think, 3. No, he was 5, I think, at the time of the 1968 tumult and so on. But there was also an expansion of suffrage for Latinos, for women, empowerment for many groups, including gays and lesbians. Things we don't think about at all. It took direct action on the civil rights model for disabled people, some of whom in the studio here, to fight and take over buildings in Washington. And as a result, like vacations, we have curb ramps that nobody notices, but people almost died for those curb ramps, the Americans for Disabilities Act. The ending of the wars in Indochina, the toppling of 2 presidents, those are well known. The 18-year-old vote, the end of the draft, and on it goes. Now, taken together, this was a formidable a set of accomplishments in about 10 years' time. Some might say 5, some might say 15. But the conclusion one can draw from it is that the 60s ended as a period because our side won sufficient reforms to calm things down. And then that would start the counter movement. And the rest is a fight over our history.
Now, at the time when you were involved in some of those very critical victories, did you experience them? Did the movement experience them as victories? Or is it more similar to some of what we go through today, what you started talking about? Oh, well, it's really not enough, and it's just a compromise or a bad compromise, or any sense that this really was for the ages, what you were doing and winning on?
I don't remember anybody ever saying, "Hey, this is the '60s." That was later. But there seems to be a process. There's people that take action for whatever reason, and they get out front, and they suffer quite a bit. Their career expectations, physical suffering. Some die. Many are jailed, and some are burned out, and they develop a bitterness that makes it difficult to take complete satisfaction in seeing, what's a good example? Lyndon Johnson declare, "We shall overcome," as he signs the Voting Rights Act. And I'm not saying that I know how to get over that. I am saying that we're freer and more able to determine our destiny than we often realize. But there's a wind against us as well as a wind for us, and that if you don't take any satisfaction from accomplishments that have been depicted as never going to happen by the establishment or end of the world by the right wing, who is going to claim these achievements for what they are? And so I'm uneasy saying this, but the book is a defense of reform. It may take revolutionaries to achieve reform.
Right. Yeah.
And then they'll be bitter. But reform again and again seems to be the pattern. We sometimes nearly go off the cliff, the country collapses, civil war, repression, police killings, terrible, terrible things happen. But again and again, whether it's labor rights or environmental laws or the New Deal or women's suffrage, the pattern repeats. And I do think that it is universal and not simply bound up with something specific about America. That's another book, but I'm working on that.
That's the next one.
Yeah.
And personally, though, did you feel either burned out, or did you feel that sense? Were you? I mean, I tease you about your dark Irish soul at times, but did you ever feel that we did it, that we accomplished something in any period or any of the victories that you were part of back then?
Well, I think any victory should be acknowledged and embraced because, as I said, nobody else is going to say that. But I think I accumulated a bitterness at the same time. I would attribute that not to Irishness so much as to my own experience. You know, one hand giveth, the other hand taken away. That's not an old Irish saying, as far as I know, but it's basically whenever something good happens, get ready for the bad weather. And it's because of this cycle. If our side wins, the other side becomes hysterically involved in trying to take it back, just like these tea parties announcing that a black Marxist is going to lead us into communism if this insipid healthcare bill passes and is signed. So our side is losing energy over the healthcare debate at the moment, and their side is rising in hysteria. Well, unless you discount their hysteria as completely, out of touch with reality, they've got to be hysterical about something, and it's reform. I'd like to get over my bitterness, but I don't want to get over my realism.
So, speaking of the realism, I was fascinated by the Machiavelli references and the way you talked about the movement versus Machiavelli in the book and all. I mean, how did you come to that understanding, and if you could explain it to us?
Well, these are the charts that I spoke of. I came at it this way, from trying to teach students who are 18 to 21 years old and who know nothing and don't know very much about the 60s from their parents, but they may want to know about Afghanistan because they know they're not going there and they feel badly about that and would like to learn. If you start with that raw material, you have to not simplify, but you have to put it in a way that they might be able to take with them. So I reduced it to something that my professor friends would say is kind of sophomoric, a chart of Machiavellians and movements. And the Machiavellians are the people that make the deals, that make the system run, the institutions. Corporate lawyers, for example, or lobbyists. They're not the owners of great wealth or ammunition. They are the operatives. Machiavelli, of course, wrote 500 years ago about how to keep the prince in power by doing whatever it took, by adopting an ethic that said it's ethical if you preserve your power, period. And people are still reading that around colleges, around the White House, around Wall Street. On the other hand, Machiavelli was very concerned in his book, The Prince, about the specter of Moses. Now, we don't even know if Moses existed, which is a wonderful thought, that he might have been worried about a spirit of some kind. But he had an intellectual breakdown. He said, Moses doesn't fit in my example because that's a theological matter and this is about politics. But Moses, especially in American history, is symbolic of the force of social movements, no? The anti-slavery movement, Jewish radicals, all kinds of people cite Moses as the alternative. So I think the struggle about movements versus Machiavellians follows this way. The movement runs into the Machiavellian order, which is red here, and it reforms the status quo, which is the blue. And the definition of reform should be concrete. It should be that there's an institutional opening created that wasn't there before, that some people should be empowered who didn't have any power before, and there should be some concrete benefit, like Social Security, something that you can put in your pocket. If you've accomplished that, you have reformed the Machiavellian order. The Machiavellians have agreed with you because they think it's too dangerous to keep resisting you. They've agreed in order to reduce your energy and to restore the Machiavellian order over the long haul. Even today, you know, Republicans are getting Democratic support for the idea that Social Security should be privatized. Even though Wall Street is completely collapsed, it's an insane idea, but it's in their DNA as Machiavellians. They lost that fight in the 30s over Social Security. They don't stop. It's not a matter of Karl Rove or individual will. It's the DNA of the Machiavellian order itself. It's like a shark. It attempts to continually eat. And we have to be very aware of that because movements are more voluntary. They're more based on human will, and they come and go. They rise and fall. It seems unfair, but what's surprising to me on the good side is how often they're successful when they don't expect to be successful at all. They can't imagine it. People ask me, are you optimistic or not? And I find myself puzzled because the people I often admire the most and cannot figure out are the people that fight back when they feel the situation is hopeless. How do they do that? So this is the counter movement. The reform has been achieved, and I've already explained this. So there's a backlash. Those are the teabaggers. There's cooptation. Those are people who want to name bridges and streets after the movement leaders. And containing of memory. This is about making the next generation feel that it's the genius of our country that has enabled these reforms. As if it was part of the master plan for America that we would be slave owners for a long time and then magically convert to abolition. They don't like the memory of armed slaves rising up in the South. They don't like the memory of Malcolm X. Memory is tailored to either be, these people want it forgotten, but it's usually tailored to make it seem consistent with the current American story, which is where Barack Obama comes in. You know, he is seen in this dominant narrative as further proof that we're the greatest country in the world. And you're supposed to forget the suffering, the unnecessary struggle that generation after generation of African Americans and their supporters went through to get to this point. The point is this point. Forget the past. I think Clinton actually used that as a campaign song. What was it called? Jefferson Airplane. Don't stop thinking about tomorrow.
Yeah.
No, yesterday's gone. It's not gone. He found out.
And talk a little bit about why memory is so important. Why, there's.
You can talk about this better than I.
No. I mean, I think though that you talk about it here in terms of the '60s, and I think there's been a tendency on many people's part, movement people, to think this is all new and has never happened before,
right?
And that any fight around past memory or issues or history is irrelevant.
Old stuff.
Fact, yeah, no. But in fact, it's got some.
All right. Well, let's look at it here. This is the linear one. This is the Machiavellian timeline, and this is the movement timeline, from the margins to the mainstream to the achievement of reform to the demobilization. And the final stage is about memory. And I don't know, this is really cyclical, but memory is what I said it's about, on the Machiavellian side, the co-optation of the legacy, so that somehow there's a straight line between the radicalism of the past and the reforms of today, and the war in Afghanistan being a necessity for women's rights. That would be co-optation of memory. Amnesia is basically the forget about it, which I can't tell if that's achieved through conspiracies to suppress books, or it's in the nature of our media culture that you're fighting against. But I find my students don't remember anything, or not very much. And it's so recent. The 60s are, you have to get to the repressed memory of their parents to bring it back for them. But this is quite important to remember, as Obama, to his great credit, campaigned on. Remember, he said he was not doing this alone, but throughout American history, social movements of ordinary people, from calloused hand to calloused hand, had brought about magnificent changes in our country. And he positioned himself in that narrative. And I think that was important for the millions of Obama supporters to think they were part of a heritage. He didn't have to do that. We don't know why he did it, but I thought it was a very compelling story that he told.
Well, yeah, I think, and had that power of, that all good stories have. So moving from the power of the narrative that brought Obama to his success to the tragedy that many of us see impending with Afghanistan. Is there a frame that you would explain it in terms of using this Machiavelli movement? Do you think it's unique to Obama? Is it a military-industrial complex issue? Because on some fundamental level, this makes no sense, what's going on, this escalating in Afghanistan.
Well, it makes perfect sense to me that he's caught in the crossfire between the social movements that helped get him elected president, particularly the increased African-American turnout and the increased turnout among young people. That would be the social movement cohort of his broad Democratic base and independent base. He's caught between the movements, on the one hand, that elected him, and the Machiavellians that welcomed him tentatively, but they generally think of elections as a nuisance, and they want to get back to business. And so the mandate was unclear. I think we have to say that we're not done with the racial issue at all, because we could barely celebrate the triumph over racism. It was supposed to be not said too loudly. And his triumph was extraordinary in that sense and fits into the racial narrative. But it was not a mandate to change the Machiavellian power structure. It was a mandate for nebulous change. And there is a presidency. I talked to Jimmy Carter about this once. I said, do you think it's true that the unelected leaders of the corporations and banks are more powerful than the elected President of the United States? And being an honest man and a great man, he looked at me and he said, I learned that my first year in office. And I think that's what President Obama is now learning. There really are military contractors. There really is a Wall Street. And he's tried to run against them on the one hand and include them in his cabinet on the other in hopes that he can strike a deal in which they give up some significant reform, and I hope that he's successful. But what he may not have noticed was that his movement would weaken once he won. It would demobilize because people would go back to everyday life and leave it to Obama. And the people who had something to lose, the right wing, the Republicans, some of the military, Wall Street, would become more energized. And so even though he became president, the balance of forces would shift to his opponents. And that's where we are now. So I end the book by saying what he needs most of all, from my 50 years of watching this process and participating in it, is a new left. He says, I'm going to be I come from the left, I'm going to be a centrist. It's an invitation to us to understand that we have to not rest on electing a president. We have to continue to press the Machiavellian forces, the special interests, to yield, or they simply won't. And if he wants to be in the center, then we have to make the center progressive. And we have to do that. And my sense is that we will, but right now we're in the wake-up period. We're between disillusionment and inspiration. It's a confusing, but he's only been in office 11 months. And when we look back in 7 or 8, if he gets that far, then we'll be able to judge how far we've come. But I don't agree with the people who complain incessantly about Obama as if it's a personal deficiency on his part. I think they've lost any sense of sociology or history, that it's a deficiency in our culture and in our civic society not having the kind of strong social movements that some other countries do, and which we had in the 1960s and we need to have again.
So just the last question. What would that look like, that new left? What should we be thinking, doing? Where would a year from today, when we come back with your next book and have this conversation?
I don't know. That's the thing I concluded after 50 years of this and writing this book or teaching this book for years is the humbling conclusion that, well, I have to believe that I'm intelligent. My ability to predict is poor. The ability of intelligent people and progressive people to predict the future is poor. They didn't even predict Obama. They didn't predict the fall of the Soviet Union. They didn't predict global warming until years too late, and so on. So, I'm who am I to say? But I think the online organizing creates a global environment for the spread of inspired, feverish information. It's fantastic, that we didn't have in the 60s. There will be street movements, but I think for this next generation, the means of producing information, media, are as important as the means of producing cars for an earlier. So the struggle will be, if you want a prediction from someone who's a failed predictor, the struggle will be over and over about who controls the means of producing information.
Well, you're at the right place with Brave New Films.
It's Brave New Films.
And any words of inspiration to people watching this? Encouragement? What they should be looking, without predicting, what they should be doing?
Well, I mean, we have to end the war in Afghanistan and Pakistan, or the whole agenda of the Obama administration on the domestic side is tanked. We have to re-regulate Wall Street. We cannot allow the right wing to seize the issue of bailouts. We have to confront the environmental crisis through direct action as well as political action. These are and these issues have to flow together as well as down separate channels. But what people ask me this sort of question all the time, and I guess I'm not introspective enough about it, because all I can say is, if you really resent bullies the way I have since I was a kid, you won't stop. You have got to stand up against bullies. It's a very personal thing to me, as well as a political matter. I just can't stand their dominance and their arrogance. It feeds an instinct in me to fight the bully.
Tom's book, The Long 60s, I would recommend it highly. I think it's an affirmation of, I can't remember the quote about ideas matter, which we see over and over again. They do matter. Thank you for all the books and all the ideas. And thank you everyone else watching this online.
Thank you very much.
Excellent.
Good job.
Thank you.